Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. Hope everybody's doing well. We've got a great show for you this afternoon. I have with me today my fellow YouTube creator and fellow locals community leader, stuck in the middle.
What
and I'm
is
gonna
good?
I'm gonna I'm gonna let him introduce himself to all of you and tell his story, and then we're gonna get going on our topics. So have at it.
What's up? Thank you for having me. I go by Osiris. I have the channel Stuck in the Middle. I'm literally just a guy in my basement that started a YouTube channel. It was during this, the so-called Summer of Love, and I saw the protests. I have love for everybody who has good in their heart, but I saw issues with the protests, and I saw people who I know have good in their heart kind of turn and change. And I wanted to get my voice out there. I didn't feel like there was balance. I'm stuck
Yep.
in the middle because you could call me in the middle of a Jimmy Dore and Steve Bannon. Like I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. I don't know if I'm more right or left, whatever. It doesn't matter. I'm an independent thinker. Anybody who has love for their fellow citizen, loves the country, I'd be happy to have conversations with you. And that's why I love your channel, Deb.
Well, I'm so glad you're here because I'm trying to talk to, a broader range of people about these issues with education. I think a lot of people think that when we talk about education, it's all about just what's going on in school or talking to teachers or looking at curriculum. And we forget, every single one of us was touched by education, is still learning. A lot of people will go back and get, re-educated, or they learn new skills. They may have to educate other people in the course of their job, training people on the job, and they see what's coming to them, like out of the schools. Like if you're a manager or whatever, like, whoa. Or they have kids, their parents. And I definitely love to talk to parents about, what they're experiencing, what they're seeing. So you're sort of here as a multiple, like you're multiples of those things, aren't you? Anyway, so you mentioned to me this topic about neutrality in the classroom and could teachers be neutral? And you said you had some stuff you want to talk about that. Let's open that up and have that conversation. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the ground zero, Steve Bannon actually talked about this, that pretty much ground zero for this whole cultural, social, political battle that's happening in our country is the schools. And I think
Yep.
it all comes down to neutrality. The issue that we're having is the
Yep.
teachers, starting from the teachers union on down, they are not neutral parties in a large part in many areas. Luckily, right now, my oldest is in kindergarten. I haven't
Mhm.
seen any issues, but we have actually seen those news stories pop up. And I think this is so serious when you go back to even how the country was started. You had people who left England because of the Church of England that came,
Mhm.
and a lot of what we're seeing, whether you call it the critical race theory or, in practice, whatever you want to call it, is very
Mhm.
similar to a religion. And my question was, and my thought was, is it possible? Is it even realistically, forget about laws and constitution, is it even realistically possible to ask teachers in this environment with J6 and George Floyd, and people honestly think if I don't support Black Lives Matter, I'm a bad person? Is it
Right.
possible for teachers to be neutral?
God, that is a really good question. I mean, I've been walking around thinking, well, surely it must be possible. I didn't know my teacher's politics, but you just made the point that we're in a different we're in a different world right now. We're in we not everything was political. Going to Starbucks wasn't a political statement. There wasn't a Starbucks. Like, I
Mhm.
mean, so we didn't know the politics of CEOs. We didn't know the politics of our neighbors. We just did. It was actually considered sort of rude to openly discuss it in mixed company, right?
It was taboo.
And
Mhm.
yeah, it was really taboo. It was like stick to, the weather and things like that. And only when you know people really well, and you have to be delicate about it, because I think we understood that this could cause it cause you to lose friends, or you could disagree, and it shouldn't be a kind of disagreement that would break up friendships, break up families, and it just wasn't done. And so to your point, now that it is, can we really expect the people who are in there teaching our kids to be in a bubble? Like, leave that at the door. I honestly don't know the answer. I want to expect it.
Mhm.
I certainly do, but I don't know. Be really tough, I think.
Yeah. So my thought is I don't think it's possible. And just
Okay.
even in a vacuum, even back in the day, everybody has a little bit of bias here or there. I'll never
Yeah.
forget in elementary school, we were talking about intervention. I don't know how we talked about U.S. intervention in foreign affairs in probably sixth grade, sixth to eighth grade. And I'll
Right.
never forget me even back then saying, I probably got it from my parents or somewhere, but me saying like the US shouldn't be the world's police. But
Right.
my point of bringing that up is my teacher was completely neutral. I'll never forget. My teacher didn't say agree or disagree. She just
Right.
said, "Hey, we respect your opinion." Basically, is what she said. But
Right.
nowadays, I don't know if you in the news recently, Patrice Cullors,
Mhm.
of BLM fame, is speaking at a LA students event. So she's literally going to an event, hosted by the, LA Unified School District. So it's
Right.
not like small political things we're talking about here. We're talking about gender, we're talking about literal activism, racial issues.
Mhm.
So here's my here's what I'm throwing out. I How do you enforce it? Is my next pick. This is how it's gonna lead me down to my radical idea. My
Right.
thought was
Right.
how do you enforce someone being neutral? People have
You
talked about
can't. That
cameras, typical.
Yeah, that you can. I wanna touch on the camera thing real briefly,
Yeah.
because, you know, a lot of the people who are pushing for the cameras in the classroom are also people who complain about big government, or people who complain about, too much government surveillance, too much government in our business, and the government pushing this garbage down our throat because it's government schools. Well, who do you think is going to own the footage? Who's going to own the cameras? Who's going to hand out the contracts? Who's going to be taxing you more? It'll be quite the boondoggle. The camera you could go down and buy, or you could buy on Amazon for dirt cheap, is going to suddenly cost, $10,000. And then, oh, it was broken that day. I mean, you're putting more surveillance in the hands of the same government that's already giving your kid all kinds of questionnaires about their feelings all day. I don't think that's really going to solve the problem, is giving them more surveillance. So I don't see that as improving transparency or holding teachers accountable at all. In fact, I just see it as opening up a can of worms for a lot of other problems. And I don't like it. I don't support cameras in the classroom. I explicitly do not. And it's not just because I'm libertarian leaning, it's because I don't see how that solves the problem. Even if I supported it, I don't. Even if it was donated, I don't support it. Now,
Mhm.
to your other point about enforcing it like any other way, I will say teachers do not have the freedom of speech the students have. They're hired speech. So technically, they don't have an unlimited right to voice their opinion or talk about whatever they want. In Florida, there's what they're calling the "Don't Say Gay" bill, which is not what it is. They're just, if you read the actual verbiage, it says like, you're not going to talk about your sex life with the children. This shouldn't be a problem, right? How would you enforce
Mhm.
that? Well, I guess the same way you would have enforced it before, if it were, we used to not have to enforce it because didn't have to be a written down rule, right? Your dad, if your kid came home and said, "My teacher's telling me all about their sex life or asking me about mine," you'd be like, "What?" And then you could expect that the teacher would be reprimanded. Like, that's not okay. That's creepy and weird. We've had to write that down because social mores have changed, but not that much. You still have enough parents who are like, "No, I don't want this." So now we have to write it down because there are teachers who don't get it. So how do we hold them accountable? The same way. The kid comes home, kid says this happened. So the teacher's always going to wonder, is the kid going to go say something? And then they're dealt with. Maybe the kid records them. So there's like an inhibition, just like there always was an inhibition, but that was social. Now it's legal. Um, I mean, it's like, how do we enforce anything that we would hope goes, teachers shouldn't touch you? Do we need to write that down too? Like, so how do we hold them
That's where we're
accountable for
trending.
that?
Yeah, that's where we're
well,
trending.
that's what I'm saying. So, you know, some of these things we're just going to have to start writing down that which we didn't have to write down before, that which our kids would police by coming home and telling us, and we would hope that the peers, a teacher's peers would be like, "What are you doing? What were you talking about in class? My students came into my class saying you were talking about this." Like they would kind of self-police. But when you get to issues like politics, where it's was never quite the same social taboo as talking about your sex life. It was social taboo, but not like that.
Mhm.
I don't know. They, like I said, they don't have the same freedom of speech to talk about whatever they want. But how do you? I mean, how do you police when they say like I like Black Lives Matter or I'm wearing a Black Lives Matter
Mm.
T-shirt? What do you
Yep.
do? You can't. You know.
So I am not a fan of rules or laws that you can't really enforce. I think
Okay.
that's a
Yeah,
waste.
I would agree. Yeah.
So my thought is, the First Amendment. I think I'm leaning at the establishment clause in the Constitution, where this is where people interpret it as the separation of church and state. I think that would
Hmm.
apply to critical theory. In my opinion, it's a non-theistic religion. It's based on faith, not
Hmm.
necessarily facts. I mean, that's literally one of their tenets. Is based on
Right.
their story. So my
Sure.
thought. I know it sounds crazy, but as far as schools go, let it have free reign. Let it have free reign of freedom of speech in schools, and you go through the same process that you would if you had any complaint now with a teacher. No tip lines, no cameras. I agree completely with you on that. I understand why Tucker Carlson famously said it on his show. I think Tucker is great, but he was very off on that one. Cameras in
Hmm.
schools are not solving anything. That doesn't
Mm-mm.
logically make sense. Why not have free reign? People in LA, if they want Patrice Cullors to come speak, in Minneapolis, if they want the student newspaper to teach students how to be a proper protester, which came out in the
Hmm.
news recently, let them do it. That's Hey, where you live matters. I think we
Well,
have to.
I would agree with you, except for one thing. The taxpayers of a given city or district don't all agree with that. And yet they're all forced to pay for it. So, for example, let's flip it around and the tide turns. I mean, highly unlikely, but the tide turns
Mhm,
and you have 51% of the voters choosing conservative Republicans and they get a state school board that want to put a bunch of stuff in and it's like free reign on suddenly conservative ideas in the classroom. Power has shifted, whatever. And now, there you are. You live in that area and you are forced by law to pay your property taxes. Your property taxes are taken and put towards the schools and all these things. Plus, there's federal money coming in and paying for that. And the politics that have free reign in the classroom are intelligent design and abortion is evil and whatever, like just pick it the
mhm,
reverse. That's what the
mhm,
predominant thing is, and it's in the and you're forced to pay for it, and you say like, I don't want this, I don't like it, and they're like, too bad, so sad, you're in the minority, move or go to private school, whatever. And you're like, I can't afford to pay twice to go to school. I would leave. I'd happily leave and vote with my feet and take my kids elsewhere or whatever, but I got to work at a job and I'm told I have to go to this school and you took my money and I'm not exactly getting it back. So to me, where the problem lies with the argument that we should just let them speak and do their thing and let the market decide is it's not really a free market. If it were a free market for education and you had real educational freedom and economic freedom with your education dollars, then I would agree with you. I'm a free speech person. I'd be like, let people decide. I mean, if people all started with, if there were no public school system and everybody were
mhm.
homeschooling, and I'm a parents' rights and homeschooling advocate, people would be doing that at home, wouldn't they? There'd be like a
Yep.
little co-op of Black Lives Matter teachers. There is
Mhm.
a
There is, yeah.
black-owned homeschool company called Woke Schooling, Woke
And I'm
Homeschool.
good with that. That's private.
Yeah,
That's in your own home. Yeah.
I don't agree with their ideas, but this is America. The beauty of America is you could go be communist in your own little plot of land and have a little communist commune and nobody's going to stop you, but try to go be capitalistic in the middle of China. So, or have free speech in the middle of China. Like you can't do that. So I agree with your idea in principle, but the conditions just haven't been met to make that um the proper the proper and constitutionally correct thing to do because people are still being coerced into paying for it. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I wanna get to a place where we can agree to disagree. I know
Yeah.
this is utopia, this is we're just, brainstorming here, but I would like to see a constitutional amendment if it's needed. I'm not an expert, but whatever's needed for us to agree that so in certain areas, if the voters decide and they're okay with things being more on the right or the left side, that's what the school is. And if you
Mm.
don't, I mean, that's tough. I mean, that's how it is now. I mean, if I live in LA and I'm or San Francisco, they just recalled the 3 board members. If I'm in San Francisco, I'm not even a right winger. I'm just a normal person, and I don't like this wokeism or whatever's happening in the school. You have no choice unless you wanna do homeschooling. So, and I think, if I'm correct, do you agree with the idea and theory now that public schools should be, I don't wanna say abolished, but decentralized, right?
Yeah,
Or
I think it should be up to towns to fund their own public school. If you want a public option, then pool your resources and have that be a local referendum or something. And I do not think, and I just think the way it is now, it's too big, it's too broad, and it's got way too much force involved. The Federal Department of Education is mucking up the whole works because that has with, No Child Left Behind, then Common Core and all the money they're giving to, Title One, Title Nine, all these different programs that are now at this point entitlements because Congress passed a law to fund that force these things into the states, whether they like it or not. You now have a kind of standardization that makes that local control sort of moot. So I made a video about this yesterday trying to explain to people that your good district is no longer what you thought it was, where you thought you had sort of local control over your local school board. Your school board has control over very, very little. Very little. And it's getting to be less and less. And the more that parents yell and scream, the less local control they have, the more that is going to reside at the state with these state frameworks and so forth. The other concern with the hey, let it rip idea is that whether we like it or not, um, some ideas are demonstrably anti-individual liberty. And when you're talking about young children, sort of minor children, pre-rational children, especially K through 5th grade or so, K through 6 maybe, but up until the kids are like 11 or 12, they're concrete thinkers. And we know this. This is brain science. This is not Deb's opinion. So when you put adults in a position of power, and it is power, over children of that age, and they are in loco parentis, they're caregivers of those children for 6 to 8 hours a day. And you're saying, educate them, that you are empowering them to, just as you would worry about the power differential of a boss to an employee. You got to have a little more concern over what things they're saying, because the ideas that they express to these children could have life altering and lasting implications on their mental health, on their opinions, on their ideas. I mean, it's why religious cults work. That's why, like, you take children and do. And so the problem is, in a society that's supposed to be protecting individual liberty, where we have a Bill of Rights that says, hey, these are our values, this is what we hold dear. To me, there's an inherent conflict of interest if you let it rip. And even if it's just California, okay, and they live under
Mhm.
the same constitution, if their dominant point of view is that Bill of Rights kind of sucks, we shouldn't have a Second Amendment, we shouldn't really have a First Amendment, there should be naughty thoughts that you can't express. And the way we're going to get our anti-individual liberty, anti-US Constitution, anti-everything that is this country, we're basically using speech to foment revolution and insurrection. And we're going to do it with pre-rational, pre-literate children. To me, that's why I get twitchy about the let
Oh,
it
yeah.
rip idea, because I feel like we have their custodians of developing minds. So it's not
Mm,
the same as standing on the street corner. You wanted
yep.
to go stand on the street corner and whatever. And yes, if you're teaching your own kids, I mean, there are parents who induct their kids into religious cults. There's nothing I can do about it. If you're doing homeschooling and
Mhm.
paying for it out of your own pocket, nothing I can do about it. But I don't think the government in any way, or taxpayers should be forced to sponsor their own undoing.
Yeah.
Because effectively what critical theory is saying, no, you shouldn't have individual liberty and I shouldn't have to pay for that.
Yep.
That's my
So
take.
we're
So
I agree, and I in theory, I think I thought so there were some local areas that allowed you, I don't know, I forget which state, that allowed you to opt out with your tax dollars. Is that true? That I would fully support that.
there are movements, there are bills, and I last count, I think it was like 24 or 25 states. Were at least bills put forth to let dollars follow children in some way, shape, or
Mhm,
form. They took different forms, whether it was vouchers or take the tax
mhm,
dollars straight up. There are some states that I think already have it. Like if you don't like the school, you can go ahead and take a portion of your money and go. Um, I don't know off the top of my head which states they are. I should know. Corey DeAngelis would know
mhm,
that. But
mhm,
that's growing. That's growing in popularity. And obviously, I fully support that. I think that's actually the answer. Let the ideas let the ideas sort themselves out in the marketplace of
mhm.
ideas. It's just that when you start getting government involved in a free society, I think you have got to do your level best to keep it neutral, and that means even if you can't enforce it by law, I think what we can do as voters is we can focus on electing the people who make the decisions, the policy decisions about how our teachers are taught, and we can hold them accountable through elections, not laws, but
Yep,
we can hold them accountable through elections to say, hey, if you're going to put people in a state board of education who are pushing pedagogy that says I shouldn't have freedom, I'm going to vote you out of office. That's what I'm
yep,
going to do. That's how I'm holding you accountable so that you can hold the educators accountable to teach, you know, in a more neutral way.
yep, and this won't surprise you, Deb. I had this exact exchange with Nicole Hannah Jones on Twitter, and I give her credit. She will interact with almost anybody, and she's
She
blocked me
blocked
since.
me. Yeah, I
She
would say
blocked
she
me since.
blocked me. I
But she was
tried
interacting
having
with
this
me for
interaction with her.
so I did, and she answered it. She's and to no surprise, I said, "Hey, would you fully support being able to take your public tax dollars and use it on a private or wherever or homeschooling?"
Right,
And she said, "Absolutely not." And
right.
I'm now surprised, but here's why I bring it up. To be fully honest, I'm for the free open ideas because the people who are falling victim, in my opinion, to this critical theory pedagogy or however you want to call it in practice, I think they are a fringe minority. And if you open things up, and that's really what I was trying to do with Nicole Hannah Jones, even though I have nothing against her, when in our interactions, I was trying to indirectly show how fringe her ideas are. So I think if you have a market like this where it's more free, I don't think the crazy gender talk and all that, those schools won't be popular. They're not going to be performing well. Nobody's going to want to be there, and they will go defunct. I think
You
the
mean if the
majority of
dollars followed the kids
yep,
and you allowed people to have these. Oh, I totally
or
agree with you. Or or what? Sorry.
or even if you don't do that, which I want that to happen, even if you just say, "Hey, hypothetically, forget about the separation of church and state. If you want to, I mean, it's kind of what's happening now, but if you want to promote Black Lives Matter, critical theory of gender, race, go ahead and do it." I still think it would have the same effect. People would move. You're seeing more people homeschooling already. It wouldn't be as powerful, maybe, but you would see that separation of people like, I don't want to go to this school if this is what are they teaching math or like what's are they teaching normal science? So I think that's another way that you can expose the radical nature of these institutions and teachers. I think majority what you're seeing, like San Francisco, they got called right wingers. San Francisco, the second most liberal city in the U.S. They got called right wingers for recalling the board members who wanted to focus on renaming the schools.
Right.
The majority of people who are not even on the right, just more, I would say 75, 80% of the parents, people are kind of neutral. And then you've got 10% who are radical on either side. What do you think?
Probably, although, depending where you are, if you're in California, I don't think you have any like radical right wingers. I think you've got maybe like right leaning people, but it's mostly progressive or center right, maybe. Certainly northern, like northeastern California is fairly conservative. But I think it really would have to depend on the mobility that people have. Right now, people are trapped in 2 ways. They're trapped by virtue of the fact that they can't just take their tax dollars and go. Another way that they're trapped is they're trapped, the 70,000 or so students in the Los Angeles Unified School District are largely trapped by the economy. Like, their parents can't move, can't just pick up and move. And they certainly can't afford any other kind of school. And even if they could, the private schools are just as bad, if not worse. And they wouldn't have space for them anyway. Like, they can't build schools fast enough. So we've created a system for ourselves that doesn't have a lot of exit ramps. And so I think the idea in theory of a sort of free market for ideas and education works best when people have true freedom of movement, and whether that's physically or of their dollars, so that they can just set vote with their feet or vote with their their own opinions. The other thing that's missing is the ability to for teachers themselves. So I think you probably safely in any district, including in California, probably have a solid 20% of teachers who don't agree with any of this garbage, who would love to be neutral in the classroom or even center right in the classroom if they had their druthers. Okay. And
Mhm.
yet they have frameworks and standards, like California specifically, also New Jersey, also Massachusetts, and Washington State, Oregon, where it is the law. It is not even up for discussion. They must teach in these ways or they will be fired. They must mention these topics. They must do SEL. They must do gender ideology. In New Jersey, they must do African American studies, and they must use the curriculum materials that are on the resource list. So imagine you're a teacher who thinks this is a bad idea, or you want to present a different point of view on it. You're going to be hard pressed to do it. You're going to have to either double the work your students do, which is going to be really challenging, especially when out of one side of your mouth, you're saying,
Mhm.
so the white man is oppressive. And this is all white supremacy, according to Nicole Hannah Jones, whatever. Now we're going to read some Thomas Sowell. So if the kids in your class are picking up on they're like, I kind of like the Nicole Hannah Jones way where I don't have to do any work because I'm oppressed. Can I stick with that? I don't want to read the Thomas Sowell. That takes too long and it's big words. What are
Too
you
much
going to do?
yeah. Yep.
So, because it's not just different opinions on race in America, it's an opinion on race in America that comes with it a set of value judgments and social credit that's very emotionally satisfying and tempting. Okay. It offers something to the students besides just an opinion. It offers them, like you said, it's a religion. It offers them some sense of belonging, or it offers them a way to access virtue and social credit. So if you want to come in behind that, you're required by law to teach this, and you want to come in behind, go, and now I want to supplement with this. Now you're at odds with your students who think you're a white supremacist. They're like,
Yeah.
I need to complain about my teacher who is a Nazi. And you're
Yep.
like, all I
I
did
think
was suggest we read some Thomas Sowell.
here's what I think we are in serious, difficult times, I think, right now as a country. We've got to be able to make sacrifices. And I'll tell you, with me, I was pretty much a normie before the whole pandemic. I was pretty much a normie. I was actually
Mhm.
like a Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez supporter. I voted for Obama twice. I was probably establishment, even though I watched the news. My
So you
wife,
were like a
very,
mainstream Democrat.
I was like a mainstream Democrat. Yep.
Mhm.
And I didn't hate Republicans or anything, but I was that way, Democrat for sure. Now
Mhm.
I'm none of them. But
Mhm.
my point is my wife was like that too. And once I started shifting, she didn't make that shift with me just because she's like, I don't want to watch the news, and I don't blame her. Um, but I started dropping seeds to her because my oldest is 5 in kindergarten now. My youngest is almost 3, and
Mhm.
we've masked him,
Mhm.
which is probably one of the greatest regrets of as a parent that I've ever done. But my wife isn't going to be able to change quickly to homeschooling. Like, that's not in
No,
her
yeah,
head right now.
right,
So
I understand.
I've been dropping hints. My point is we had to sacrifice, and I knew I couldn't just snap this on a dime on my wife, but I started giving her articles telling her, if I start seeing this kind of stuff, we are going to have to start having conversations. We had
Right.
we started talking about in 2020. So now if I start seeing it when he's in first grade, second grade, whatever, we'll have to change our lifestyle or whatever. So I think it's how much do you care? If you
Right.
if you don't care, then you mean you can complain, go to the school board. I
Right.
think even if you homeschool, it
Right.
matters
Oh,
because
I do, and I'm like, "Well, I'm doing
yeah,
this."
yeah, exactly.
You can't escape. I mean, your kids are gonna be on, like, social media, or they're gonna my kids are teenagers, so I can't keep them off this all the social media. They are gonna watch movies or TV, or, it surrounds you. It's not really as free a market of ideas as, it ought to be, because the main institutions that deliver ideas to us are heavily tilted in one direction, right? And so our kids, I think, feel a lot of pressure to, because kids always do. I mean, kids feel pressure to go with what's the norm or what's the
Mhm,
mainstream. They don't think too deeply about it at first. I think with good teachers, going back to your idea of kind of like let it rip or do both, if teachers were taught in their college programs, or if they had lots of alternative paths to becoming a teacher, if we opened that up to people in other fields and said, look, you can pass a test and be certified and make the test pretty basic, right? um and then you could have people go in, like, let's say you went into the classroom, and I think you would be able to say, all right, so we're going to be reading some Ibram X Kendi here from Stamp from the Beginning, and I want you to read that. And his argument is, so you could like present like his argument about race is X.
mhm,
Okay. Whatever. And I also side by side want you to read, let's take that Thomas Sowell. Okay. And I want
mhm,
you to read this, or Carol Swain, or somebody, somebody else, or Charles Love. And I want you to
mhm,
read this. Okay. Like, we're going to do kind of a chapter of each one. And their argument is X. All right. And then I want you guys to come back, and we're going to do a compare and contrast discussion in the class. And I think you could, like you were talking about the seeds. It's not so much that you would want them to come out on either side, right? That wouldn't be right. Then you're not really an educator. You would stay right there in the middle, and you'd be like, if somebody goes, well, he's right because, racism was really bad in the past. He was
mhm,
like, okay, well, do you see progress today? And you could plant the seed of asking the question, asking the question.
mhm.
Then the other person who goes, well, I think that's totally wrong because something, like, but don't you agree that there has been some oppression? And so in other words, you get both kids starting to realize maybe where the other one's coming from a little bit. And even if they still land where they land, or maybe they don't, whatever. But the point is, you as the teacher have done your job, because you've told them that these ideas are ideas, they're opinions, they're not facts. And you can choose at the age of whatever to decide that this person's ideas or this person's opinions make more sense to you personally than those. But I've at least exposed you to different ones that come at it differently. I've asked you questions that kind of challenge both. And
Mhm.
now you got to realize that that's what you should be doing. That's the process you need to go through as you grow, as you get older, that you should always be asking questions. And so the teacher, they walk out, they don't know what I think. They don't necessarily know which side I'm on in that argument. That's not my job. My job is to just say, there's not only one set of ideas, guys. We, the government, that's the government, right? The government shouldn't be in the
Mhm.
business of picking winners and losers in that idea war. That would be an infringement of freedom of speech. So I can see that side of the argument. I just would prefer that start when the kids are older than fifth grade. I would prefer it start when they're pretty proficient at reading, when they've had some background in history. In particular, I would like it to be of the United States, but if they can have, a little bit of US history and a little bit of, let's say, Western European history, because that is where we trace our origins. Even if you do cover the slave trade within that, that's great. Okay, because they need that context. I just don't think they're starting with some of these lessons at like 6 and 7 years old.
Yeah,
And
it's
so
n
that, I
no,
think
yeah,
we need to separate.
mm,
We need to protect the the
mhm.
the minds of the most innocent from big ideas that, let's face it, there are a lot of adults who like aren't ready to think about these things critically. Right? So if you're under
Yeah,
10,
mhm.
it's too much. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm old fashioned, but I just think it's too much.
Oh,
I just do.
absolutely. I'm not an expert in education, but I was thinking like 10th, 11th, 12th
Oh,
grade, not even
oh
ninth
yeah, for
grade
sure.
for
Yeah.
but I I would be all for it if what we were presented with, here's critical theory or however you talk about it, and then here's another argument about it. And
Right.
not only do we show both sides, we learn how to we can live together, we can be neighbors, we can be okay and disagree on this
Right.
I would love that. But it's almost like, remember when General Mark Milley said, he was in front of the hearing in Congress, he was like,
Yeah.
"I wanna understand white rage." And everybody was upset because it didn't sound like he was trying to understand it from a philosophical view. Like, if you are using the term white rage in that way, that means you sound like you're into that cult or religion. So
Yeah.
if you actually mean it, like, I want to understand what other people mean when they
Right.
say this
You should
term,
probably
then
phrase it like that.
exactly, that's how
First of
you would
all, yeah.
naturally phrase it.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
I would be all for it, but I don't think it's possible with these topics, because that's the brilliance of it. That's why I refer to it as neo-Marxism as well.
Yeah.
The brilliance of Karl Marx is you
Or
are
like,
either for yes, yes, race Marx.
James
That's a
Lindsay's
great
latest book, Race
James
Marxism.
Lindsay. Yeah, New
Yes.
Discourses. James Lindsay is
Yeah.
amazing, and
Yep.
the beauty of it is it divides you into two pieces, and it actually does the opposite of teaching you how to live with your neighbor. It teaches you that your neighbor is your enemy if they don't agree. And this
Exactly.
is what
And that
Marxist is.
and that's why I
Mhm,
worry about with children, because you already got
mhm,
children who tend to be more dichotomous thinkers. They tend to be, certainly when they're younger, they're more concrete. In the teenage years, you've got to guard against them othering each other anyway, because that's part of the whole adolescent thing is where do I fit in? And I'm trying to pull away from my parents. And so, that's why they're so susceptible to gangs. That's why because the idea that they sort of can who am I is a big question. Forming your identity of what you're going to be when you're adult is a big question, but it's so important, I think, for adults to, you know, respect the boundaries of the child and not project identities onto them, whether it's a parent doing it or a teacher doing it. Like, parents shouldn't be like, you're an athlete because I was an athlete. You're going to
mhm,
Harvard because I
mhm,
went to Harvard, or you're this because I'm, or,
mhm,
you vote Democrat because I vote Democrat, or whatever.
mhm,
That's just as bad and just as abusive as the teacher saying, you will be an anti-racist because blah, blah, blah of the Kendi variety. So you're
mhm,
violating a sacred boundary, in my opinion, which is this new developing thing called the teenage, the young person's individual identity. Let them figure it out. They're going to stumble, trip. They're going to, I'm sure you're different than what you were when you were 16 and when you were 18.
mhm.
So am I. And that's their process to go through. That's their journey. And it's not for me to tell them. And what they're doing now is coming in and telling these kids. And the other thing that's challenging about critical theory specifically is that critical theory doesn't it's baked into the theory that you're not allowed to disagree. That
Yep.
if you disagree, you're guilty. If you disagree, you are the bad guy. So it's like
Mhm.
baked right in there. And there's a um in the critical theory is you owe. Okay, so
Yep.
there's like an original sin and you have to atone. You're never done for atoning. There's no redemption, there's no grace. You're never done. You're going to have to do it the rest of your life, little child. And so how does one say, I just disagree with that, because the person who believes it is basically telling you, I don't care if you disagree. I'm going to come after you and take your stuff because you owe
Yep.
it to me. That my believing in this faith, in this set of beliefs, equals my justification to quite literally aggress against you, whether it's through a law that it tells me I get to take your property, or I get to step into your job and you got to step back, or whatever, or you can't go to
Mhm.
college because there's a quota to make sure I can go to college. People who believe in that mindset or that viewpoint, there's receipts that go with that. That's the challenge. It's not one of those live and let live kind of belief systems.
Yep. And
It's kind of
I
like
think
Islamism.
yeah, yeah, and I think for me as a parent, I'm not at this because I'm not having issues right now in my school, but I think parents are
Yeah.
doing the right thing going to the school board. The best thing that I did with my child to kind of see what's going on in the school, to see if they're doing any of this, was actually just volunteering. They have sign up for you to
Mhm.
come in, and you read a little book to the kindergartners and walk with them to the lunchroom. You'll spend 2 3 hours and say bye. And when you go in there, you can see what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think those type of things, of course, always peaceful, always respectful, And if you do that, then you can kind of see what's happening. And
Right.
you're seeing parents are that's why the DOJ had to label, in certain regards, parents as terrorists, because they were
Right.
like, this ground movement's coming. So I think what's going on right now is the right way. And it's trending towards some type of radical change to education. I don't know what it's going to be, what's going to
Mhm.
look like, but I think what's happening is a beautiful thing in our country.
I hope so.
Mhm.
I I I mean, my goal, certainly with the content that I create, is to educate parents and even teachers, because like I said, I bet there are about like 20% of teachers out there are like, I
Mhm.
don't agree with this and I don't know quite what to do, right? Or I just want to
Mhm.
leave. I don't want to be lumped in with all the parents that are hating on teachers right now because I want to teach and I love kids, and but I want to be in this situation where they're telling me what I have to do. So I do hope it's something positive. I hope it doesn't trend in the direction of like what Maryland is doing, where they want to start regulating homeschool more strictly. And every year they have that conversation at Harvard where it's like, how many ways can we come up with to ban homeschooling? So, the unions are very powerful. We've got, I don't know how many million teachers. I think it's at least a million people who are members of these unions, and it's going down. Their membership is going down because you don't have to pay dues, and that's part of why they are doing so many things to kind of keep it a jobs program, like keep it, like, don't worry, you're not going to lose your job. We're going to get more money. We're going to get you benefits. We're going to, because they want
Mhm.
people to keep paying those dues. I hope it's something positive, but this this is the biggest challenge that I've seen, certainly to my beliefs as far as being a free speech person. Because like you, I've been sitting there like, I don't love the idea of policing a teacher's
No.
speech,
Yeah, yeah,
but
that's
they're taking it to
mhm,
like ridiculous degrees.
mhm. Yeah, and the camera stuff and all that, it's just that's not a learning environment to me too.
Mm,
There's so many reasons, like you said, financial, even if it's not financial, would it be effective? Who owns it? All that kind
right.
of it just doesn't work. So I would say the homeschool the push. You've heard murmurs about this to ban homeschooling. I think even in
Yeah.
France, did they do it or over in Europe somewhere? I
Well,
think somewhere they even
Germany has a complete ban since Hitler on homeschooling. It's never been lifted.
that's all you need to
And the
know.
Yeah,
That's
that's it.
wow.
Yeah. And the Prussian system that we have, we got our system from Germany, and it was pre-Hitler, of course, but he admired the Prussians. That was the militaristic part of Germany, and he admired everything they did. It was very regimented, very, regular, and
Mhm,
he just came in and made it even more so. He got rid of any progressive, anything in education, fired all the Jewish teachers, fired all the teachers that wouldn't be re-educated to teach race purity. They went from, and it's an interesting parallel because they went from being one of the more evolved, enlightened people at the time, even with their Prussian system,
mhm,
to, very scientifically advanced and things like that. They took a giant leap backwards because he came in and he said, we're going to replace a lot of the focus on science, objective science and literature and poetry, like all the things that they were really adept at. We're replacing that with race science, so like racial purity. So science got replaced with 90% of the time they're talking about race purity and all that. And then they spent a lot more time on physical exercise, being outside and being, Teutonic
mm,
strong. And they de-emphasized the reading of fiction, just like with the
mm,
exception of like the Nordic myths and things like that. They de-emphasized because so much fiction was considered to be like debased and, like whatever, poor morals and all this. So they only read like German
mhm,
authors. And what you see happening with the woke stuff is they want to get rid of the classics.
yep,
They want to have justice focus in science, no more objective science. That's too white, equity, math. So I see a lot of this similar things of where the way we get our political ideas in is we have to eliminate all the objectivity, eliminate that neutrality, that empirical
mhm,
approach to learning, and have kids become ideologues. We teach an ideological framework. And they even say so with a justice mindset, and they should be focused
yep,
on equity and activism and civic engagement. And if you go back and read the writings of Hitler, he would have said the same. He would have said
Yep.
civic engagement. He would have said working on, racial awareness. He claimed to be liberating the German people from oppression. It's really creepily similar.
Yeah. I think I saw the other day the National Education Association, the NEA.
Mhm.
They said something to the effect of, teachers should not be neutral. They actually said the opposite. They literally said education is political. So you
Yep.
see it's the same tactic, different philosophy, but I mean
Yep.
ideology, but the exact same
That's
tactics
what
are
I was
being
taught.
used.
In 1989 in graduate
Mhm.
school, I went into the class, it was history class, and I thought it was a class about how to teach history. And instead, and my undergraduate was American Studies, so I had taken tons of history. And instead,
Mhm.
the entire class was about the politics of teaching. The entire thing, the first day, the professor said, teaching is a political act. It's inherently political, and
Wow.
your job is to. We had to read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Your job by teaching is to liberate the minds of your students from the oppression of their society and their surroundings. And I remember just being like, "Whoa." Here's this guy. What was interesting is he wasn't even American. He was British.
Oh.
And, and I thought it was kind of ironic. I felt like saying, "Buddy, maybe take a seat." I'm kidding. But, but he was saying that we were political activists going into the classroom to liberate our students, and it didn't matter how much I disagreed. That was and the other students are nodding along, and the other, people in the
Mm.
class were graduate students were like, "Oh, yes, this makes perfect sense." And I was all alone in that class disagreeing. It's not that I disagree that teaching has a that public schools are inherently political, because they obviously are. They are government
Mhm.
run schools. There's
Mhm.
no way to get around it. Whoever's the ruling party in power, or whoever's running your state and deciding on your state standards, or whoever did decide them when they were adopted 4, 5, 6 years ago. So let's say it's
Mm.
Ron DeSantis is in the governor's
Mhm.
mansion right now. If the state standards were adopted 5 or 6 years ago, it could be somebody else. Okay.
Mhm.
So that was done to advance the ideas of the political entity and power at the time that they were made, at the time that they were written, and time that they were adopted. There's no way to get around that. But how that shows up in the classroom, it used to be handled more locally. And what he was saying was different from, hey, government school is essentially, people voted and that's what you're going to teach. What he was saying is, you're a liberator. You are a savior. You personally are going in to the classroom to awaken their minds to the terrible oppression around them. And I'm like, no, don't
Yeah.
want to do that. Don't
Yep.
agree.
I think
So,
yeah, I think another way to combat that, and let me know what you think here, is I've seen a push to go away from testing standards, and I don't know what the right standard is, but I know that those who have political, motives in mind, a lot of times they don't like to see standards because their political motives don't show up in those standards unless they create new ones or eliminate them or lower them.
that's
So I don't
correct.
know if it's testing, if what I don't know what the right standards are, but we've got to push to make sure that we have something that we can measure. I know for sure what I'm seeing in Baltimore, where the 75 or 77% of the high school seniors are reading at an elementary level. Like that's
Yeah.
failure. I don't care. We don't even need to talk about critical theory. That is failure, and that needs to change. What's your
Right.
thoughts on the standards that we should be pushing for as parents?
Um, I would like it to go back to the more teacher driven standards. Like, let's go back to a professional teaching force where, in other words, we don't have tests to make sure we have, one test that accountants take to become a CPA, right?
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
they've passed that they're proficient at doing the CPA thing. And then they go, they have that designation and you go and they do your taxes. But,
Mhm.
you know, we don't we don't continue to like do more and more tests. I think if you have a teacher and you say this is a professional teacher, then you have professional principals who know how to evaluate the teachers, and then you look at how they're testing their students, and they are responsible to come up with their own. It used to be this way. You come up with your own test to assess, did my students learn to read? And if you're asking me like when, what would the standards be of the time frame or so forth? I mean, that's the problem with having a public system where everybody has this sort of entitlement because they paid with their taxes to like get a certain product. It's hard to measure the product of education. So you get arbitrary things like a grade level or an age level when it really ought to be more like, you know, if there's nothing organic that we've identified, like dyslexia or a learning disability that you were born with or whatever, probably by the age of 8, you should be reading. You might be reading way before that, but I would think, for most people by 8, but certainly no later than 10. But believe it or not, there are kids who don't really start reading proficiently till 10, and then they take off like rockets. You'll see them in homeschool quite a bit. But
Mhm,
if
mhm,
in right now, it's if you're not reading by 3rd grade, it's like, bye bye, we're leaving, and the train has left the station, and you are
mhm.
screwed. Okay.
Yeah.
So that kid maybe needed more. But the teachers, if we had smaller schools with more localized control and professional teaching force that could say, I know based and you'd probably know pretty quickly. I know which amongst my students are having trouble and I need to help out. And so I'm going to put them in this kind of a little group and we're going to do some separate things. And I'm not testing them. I'm watching them read. I'm reading with them.
Mhm,
And if they are struggling and they're having trouble, they're going to stay back. They're going to stay and continue on. And then when they're ready to move on, they move on. And if that's in October of the next year, if that's in November, they move on.
mhm,
And it's not that big a deal because they go into a multi-age classroom. Okay, so they're in a multi-age classroom and the curriculum isn't taught on a let's go, got to cover. It's more like, what books are you going to read now? And okay, you're going to be like Montessori is a good model for that, for example. Even in
mhm,
a classical model, where it's a lot more regimented and you do have years and so forth, because they're still testing in a more qualitative way. Like, can the student write? Can the student write complete sentences, read a passage aloud, do things? It's not the kind of multiple choice check a box test. So you have professional
mhm,
teachers evaluating students based on their ability, their proficiency with skills, and they only advance them accordingly. You don't just arbitrate. And if you can't be, it's like you need a tutor, you need to do stuff in the summer, et cetera, and so forth. Professional teachers can do that. They can design lesson plans and they can be evaluated based on the results of how many kids are
mm,
happily learning, quiet, moving along, reading books. A
mhm,
principal used to be able to walk into a classroom, go up to a kid and say, "Can you read me from you can read something to me from the book?" And the student would be able to
mhm,
say, "Sure." So blah 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 blah. Blah. That's wonderful. You're doing such a great job. Move on to the next kid. We don't do that now. The administrators and teachers have paperwork to check off bureaucratic stuff that has to do with what equity and inclusion and SEL and all these things
mhm.
that they don't even half the time know how their students are doing until the
Yep, and I
standardized test comes along.
yeah, that to me, that seems like a under and maybe it's just what I'm reading and seeing, that's a under discussed part, because when you're not focusing on those, that's what leaves room, because when I
Yeah,
first started seeing all this stuff happening in the classroom, it's been happening over 10 years. I just found out recently over the last 2 years, but I'm like, "Where do they have time to do this? Like,
they
how do they have
don't.
so much time to be doing all this stuff?" It's because there's no accountability. How do seniors in Baltimore not know how to read? Like, there's no accountability along the way. They shouldn't be advanced. Something
Right.
ultimately, it's on the parents or guardians. We
Yep.
You can't blame teachers, but still, how does that happen in the school system?
Well, you can't blame maybe not. I mean, here's the problem. Parents are not being told.
You gotta
I've tutored some kids whose parents, are being told the kid's getting an A. The kid's doing great. The parents asking about their second grader or third grader, how are they doing? Now, I agree with you. Ideally, the parents going home and going,
you got
"Here, let's read this book together. How's it going?" So like you're
that's your
checking the teacher's work.
mhm,
You
mhm.
got to
That's
check. The
your
teacher
respons
says they're reading, check if they're reading. No, I agree with you,
Yep,
but there are some parents, and let's say imagine that you are an immigrant and English is not your first language.
mhm,
And so you send your kid to the public school because, hey, you put them in the public school. They go and you go, and the teacher's like, "Oh, they're doing fantastic. They're doing so well. It's all wonderful. It's all good." Okay, and you have to
mhm,
trust them. Like, what
yep,
else? English is your second language, and you're just barely learning, and so you aren't
yep,
necessarily going to be able to go home with them and sit and maybe you do go read me this book in English or whatever, but maybe you just don't or can't or whatever. You take their word for it. You should be able to. We should be able to trust these people to tell us the truth, and we should have a definition of fine that makes sense. Fine is not, it's not my job yet to tell you. And that's
Mhm.
what I'm finding. We have a wait to fail policy in a lot of our public schools, where if you're a first grade teacher, a second grade teacher, and you see some signs that there's a problem, you don't say a word until after that third grade test. It's not your job to say. So fine equals it's not my job to say.
Yep,
And
and your
what happens, sorry, go ahead.
oh, no, no, just real your point is so, appropriate considering immigration and how many people are coming over that
Yep.
English isn't their first language.
And you don't always have an interpreter. I mean, there, if you're a
Mhm,
refugee from some of these countries, like, there may not be an interpreter. You might have one just for the conference, but it's not that easy, and they don't have necessarily access to the books and the library. So, if we're going to be really concerned about things like, you know, being culturally responsive, I
mhm,
talked to Going Godward on this channel. She works with refugee children, and she said they talk a good game about cultural responsiveness, but they don't actually do it. And then they're just, promote the kid, promote the kid. And so, there's a lot of blame to go around. It's too easy to go, it's the teacher. Okay. But remember, the entire system sets up incentives. They're perverse incentives so that you
mhm,
end up recruiting teachers who don't mind this. You end up with a core of teachers, younger especially. I mean, the older ones have been there a long time, don't like this and they complain.
mhm.
But the ones who are younger, coming in the pipeline of teachers coming into the profession, why would you go? Why did I leave teaching? Why are people leaving teaching in droves? Why do people gravitate towards it now? Because they don't mind the priority being politics and not academic excellence. They're all for that. They were educated the same way. They think this is their
Mhm.
great opportunity to, foment revolution. Meanwhile, the 50-year-old teacher is like, I'm out. This is
Yep,
nuts. I'm a professional and I can't do my job this way.
and that's exactly the point. No different than purging the military, police force. You're basically purging the teacher base and
Mhm.
keeping it pure to people who are going to subscribe to your ideology. But
Right.
I will say, you were talking about banning there's kind of a murmur and talks about banning homeschooling and all
Yep.
these different things, and even labeling parents generally as terrorists. I
Right.
actually think those are good things because
You think it'll be a
not
backlash?
good not good
Oh,
things,
oh.
but they're showing the power and the
Mhm.
movement is heading in the right direction. If the whatever you wanna call it, the regime, the cabal, the government isn't pushing back on homeschooling and parents at school, that means resistance. Just like
Right.
Black Lives Matter. You're not the resistance when you're on Walmart and Amazon. You know you're the resistance where there is that pushback from the government, and that means you're
Right.
making an impact. So that's why I saw some comments in the chat. That's why I am optimistic.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I do think there's reason for optimism. I've spoken to a lot of people who feel the same way, who say, no, this is good. People are waking up. I think where I come in on that is I agree, but I want to make sure that parents of kids who are in school today understand that it's not coming for their kid. So in other words, I'm not saying stop doing what you're doing and stop being
Mm,
active and stop, speaking out because it's not going to help your kid. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying maybe redirect your efforts to things that will help your child a little bit. So split it up, look
mhm,
for alternatives. People have said to me, well, what about, can I just supplement? And the challenge with supplementation is that with the social emotional learning where they're really trying to get inside your kid's head and make
mhm.
out like the parents are oppressive and the parents are a problem, and separate the kids from the parents to a larger degree.
Yep.
They're triangulating with parents at a younger age, which means that now your elementary school kid might be coming home and going, "You're not my teacher, you don't know." And so then I've
Yep.
tried to tutor kids where the kid's like, "But I'm getting an A. Mom, I don't need a tutor. I'm getting an A. Leave me alone." And meanwhile, the mom knows they've seen the materials coming home and they're like, "This is pathetic. This is like not good enough for my kid."
Mm,
And,
mhm,
I don't even understand how they're getting an A. How are they getting an A? This doesn't make sense. They can't write a complete sentence. They're not punctuating properly. They're not spelling properly. And they're in seventh grade. And
mhm.
how do you persuade your kid? I mean, try making a middle schooler do something. You can
Yeah,
say, "I'm gonna
try
take your phone," or "You don't get your phone, you can't watch TV."
mm,
I mean,
mhm.
but you see what they've done. They're getting
Yep,
inside the family dynamic, and making it so that like you in order for you to supplement or get your kid the amount of education they deserve or need or whatever that you think will make them proficient, you are the bad guy now. You really are the oppressor that they
Yep.
say that you are, because they're like, I'm getting an A. This is good enough. And people say to me, but like, won't they know the difference? Won't they see the substantive difference between the really good novel and the stupid little short reading they did at work? That's like saying, won't they see the nutritional difference between a plate of vegetables and chicken nuggets? They've eaten the
Yeah.
chicken nuggets. They're full.
Mhm.
They're satisfied. They're done. They don't, like you come along and go, but you can get more nutrients from these carrots. They're like, yeah, I'm good. Thanks. So it's not as easy as just like, I'm going to
Oh, no.
supplement,
Oh, yeah.
good luck to you.
Yeah, and that's been my plan, is to supplement, but, I mean, time-wise, and it's very difficult. And he's
If
only
you
in
start
kindergarten.
now, though, your son
Mhm.
is a son, right?
Yep, yep,
Yep.
2 sons,
Okay.
yep,
Okay. So your sons are young.
yep,
And if you start now setting yourself up as the co-teacher, and if you in
yep.
fact describe yourself that way, establish yourself that way, keep the tech out of their hands for as long
Mhm,
as you possibly can, like till they're in 7th grade, like no joke, like all the way through elementary
mhm,
school, just do not give them tech. Then, I mean, we're talking like maybe on the weekend they get to play a video game or something, but it's,
mm,
it's not free reign on the tech
yep,
until they're proficient at reading. Then they'll be avid readers. They're more likely to listen to you. They're more likely, because I have other kids I tutor whose parents did that
mhm,
and they love the tutoring. They see it as extra. In fact, they'll sit and commiserate with me about how their teacher at school is kind of a lame brain. Okay. So,
mhm,
because their parents took an approach from a very young age of, the school's kind of this necessary evil that I'm kind of using because reasons, but it's my kids are going to have piano lessons. My kids are going to go to, separate tutors for math. They're going to, so they were used to it. They were used to their parents taking time out of every day from an early age to do something outside of it, or they called it practice. That's what they called it. We're going to practice what you're
oh,
doing at school. And then they say, oh, we're going to practice using this book. So instead of it being like a battle, I don't think you're getting enough at school. Da, 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 da.
mhm,
It was like, we're going to practice what you've learned. Okay, you're getting an A. That's awesome. So glad. I want to make sure, the A is not the really important thing to me. The A
mm,
is just like, that's fine. That's the school's A. I want
mm,
you to learn more. So
mhm,
you can do it. I don't mean to say like you can't. I just don't want parents walking blindly into it going, it'll be fine. I'll just supplement if the time comes. Like, no, you got to start the process at the beginning, like you're doing, and keep it
mhm.
consistent as they go through. And then you're basically homeschooling at night and on the weekends.
Yep,
that's
you're doing a little
that's
bit, mhm.
yeah, that's basically what you're doing.
Yeah. But I think that's why your channel is so, big, and that's how I started following you. I forgot exactly how I found out about you, but that's why I started following you, 'cause I was preparing myself and my wife to, like, full have to homeschool, but then I'm
Right.
like, "Oh, you talked about supplementing, and
Right.
your discussion is bigger than just go to the school board and complain." No, no.
Yeah.
We gotta take the power into our own hands as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've even been saying to people like, in many cases, don't go to the school board, because unless you're going to complain about like mask policy or food, like the
Mhm,
meal policy or the bathroom policy or things
mhm.
that they, safety policies, locks on the doors. I mean, these are things they do control at the local school board level. But when you go and say like, I don't like the critical race theory in the curriculum,
Is
you're
that
not going to get anywhere because it's not decided by them.
Are you talking about the government basically subsidizing this stuff from the federal
Well,
level?
it's not just at the federal level, it's like the state is mandating it.
Mm,
They have, equity
mhm,
policies, they're giving out resources, they're putting in frameworks where it's just pretty much mandatory. And the teachers have been educated that way with the critical theory and critical pedagogy. So unless you fired all the teachers, which isn't the job of the school board,
mhm,
even if the superintendent's job, because they do hire and fire the superintendent, but the superintendent's job is to implement the state standards. The state standards explicitly say pursue equity and do it like this.
mhm.
And what are you going to do? So
I couldn't I couldn't believe that that language is in, like,
yeah,
everywhere. The
it's
word
everywhere.
equity and the SEL, it's oh,
And it's at the
unbelievable.
top down. So when you're
Mhm,
going in at the bottom in the school board, the local school board, that's like just not the place to go. I think people, first of all, once upon a long, long time ago, pre No Child Left Behind, it
mhm,
was the
that's
place
awesome.
to go. But it's
Mhm,
like, I don't think people really. connected the dots of understanding what having a No Child Left Behind and then a Common Core and then, all these different grants and even having a federal Department of Education in the first place, I don't think people really understood the amount of local control they lost in getting all this money from Washington. Okay. So
Great
there's always
point.
strings attached. You think, oh,
Great
money, money.
point.
Yeah. There's a lot of strings
So
attached. So sorry, go ahead.
well, no, I know. I think the biggest benefit from the school board stuff is probably it's these clips going viral and just creating
Yes.
awareness. But you're
That's a
right.
plus.
So, what would you suggest? Say, for
Mhm.
example, my school just snapped the fingers and it just became totally woke. And
Right.
I'm a parent. I'm not going to do home. Just hypothetically,
Right.
what would you say is the right step or suggestion?
Well, if you can't pull your kids out, if that's just like not an option,
That's
then
number
your
one, though,
next,
right?
yeah.
Number one's pulling them
Well,
out.
number one, be pulling them out or
Mhm,
go and get samples of the offending curriculum or lessons or whatever, whether it's because it's critical theory or because you feel like it's insufficiently rigorous. Because
mhm,
I will tell you that to me, that's as big, if not more of a threat to your child than the specifics of what they're teaching them is that they're not teaching them to read and do math and all these things properly
yeah,
and they're just not learning. They're being deprived a proper education. So they can't even ask questions about the bogus content because they can't read. So whatever it is, you get samples, you get examples, you go to the state standards, you go on the website and find your way to the state's Board of Education website, find those state standards, give samples of your kids' work that are coming home, and go to people that you know in the district and just start seeing if there's any appetite for starting like a micro school or some other kind of like a co-op or something
mhm,
so you guys could share the burden of homeschooling. So it's not like in your living room, but maybe there's a church basement. You guys start a co-op like in a co-op. It's at a church so that there are alternatives. See if there's like 10 families, even 5 families, and you guys can figure it
mhm,
out and work it out so that you could even possibly hire a teacher if you kind of pooled your resources. So there are things 529 money can be used for K-12 expenses for private schools. So if there's things that you
mhm,
could do there. Don't trust the private schools, but to make your own little school. The other thing I would say is, and if that's just not possible at all, you should connect with one of the parent grassroots organizations that exist already, whether it's Parents Defending Ed, Moms for Liberty, No Left Turn in Education, or whatever. Find one that's a different name in your local area and, that's also where you can start to network about finding people for microschooling because there might be some people in there
mhm,
who would be already inclined and be like, "Hey,
mhm,
are you game? Are you game? Are you game?" We all live in the same state. We're living the same, maybe live in the same city. Start a chapter also. But what you should be spending time and money on rather than running for school board or supporting candidacies for school board, not that that's just
mm,
a bad idea. It's just not going to solve your problem, is
mhm,
focus on finding those candidates for state legislature and governor
mhm,
that you can support and start lobbying them hard on transparency and parental rights because the governor of your state has the most power. Okay. But you
mhm,
still need the support of the legislature because even if the governor is all with you 100%, depending on how
mhm.
your state sets up its state board of education, he or she may or may not get to appoint all the members. Some states, it's
Yep.
like they appoint 3, then the legislature picks 3, then teachers unions or the teachers pick 3, whatever. I mean, they're chosen in different ways depending on the state. Some are even directly elected by the people, like a
Mhm,
few. So, but the majority of them in most states are either chosen by the governor or put there by the legislature. So you need to have a friendly legislature who's friendly to parents, friendly to education freedom, school choice, if you want to call it that. I personally like to call it education freedom because that might mean the dollars follow the kid. School choice sometimes means vouchers, which means you're running the money through
mhm.
the government anyway. But
Yeah.
support the people who are going to go to your state capital and represent parents and represent education freedom because that's where you have that's where you're going to have the biggest bang for your buck and your time. That's where you put your political energy.
And
And
energy there.
then you
Yep.
put your social and your sort of local energy towards trying to get people to start something. And if you can't start a micro school, if you can't get people out of the school to do that, just make sure you are 100% on top of, like, get into that Chromebook, look at everything that they're doing. If you have issues with it, go have a relationship with the individual teachers. Don't make it, don't make it adversarial. Go in, introduce yourself, say, I have some concerns about the state curriculum. So depersonalize it. I have some
Ooh,
concerns about
nice.
how the state curriculum is being implemented. I'm really curious about the resources you're going to utilize in your classroom to implement the state standards. Do you mind if I take a look at those? So before you go to FOIA requests and get all adversarial, connect with the teacher. See if you can ally with the teacher. Some teachers, like, Frank McCormick and Ramona Bassinger, they're closing their doors and being like, see if you can
Mhm,
form alliances and get them to give you inside scoop on what's going on. And then the other thing you can do is get with those other parents and strengthen your local community organizations, whether it's Kiwanis Rotary Club, the local community center, start a book club, start some outside of school activities for your kids so they can socialize and read books and do things that are more in line with your values. Not everybody goes to church. If you go to church, fine,
mhm,
make sure they're in youth group. But if you don't go to church, if you don't have a synagogue, if you don't have that kind of a community organization, you have got to get that for your kids, because that is the antidote to this, school is your family.
mhm,
School and your affinity group by race is your family. Like, this is where you belong. So the antidote to the real cultural Marxism piece of it is
mhm.
you go supply the culture yourself. Make sure your kid is doing after school activities. Make sure they have a good friend group of people that share your values, and reinforce that. So I hate to say it, but parents are going to have to start parenting on purpose a little bit more. We can't autopilot this anymore. Back in, maybe
Mhm.
the 50s and 60s or so, maybe even sometime in the early 80s, our parents could set it and forget it. There's the school. We bought into a good school
Yep,
district, high taxes. There
yep,
you go. I'm done.
yep.
Or maybe, like, we put you in the soccer group and we
Mhm.
to go to church on Sundays and we don't have to discuss it any further. You're going to have to be a lot more intentional about these
Yeah,
things.
that's great information, and you brought up the 5 is that the college savings account? The
College
529?
savings, yeah, 529
Mhm.
accounts can be used for K-12 expenses, but I don't know if they
Oh,
have to be tied to a school. Like, they might
okay.
have to be tied to an accredited school, which is why I say that if you can form a micro school in the legal sense, and um there are online organizations, like places you can go where you can hire teachers and they give you the lowdown on how to start a micro school and things like that. And if you do that or form a private education association there, which is, I think, called it's like a PEA or something, some of those lines. Um, if you do that, then legally, I think you're basically a school, but you have to check
Mhm,
out your state law, and that might work. I know it works with private schools. And it's a little known thing
mhm,
that people don't realize they can use 529 funds for private
mhm.
schools.
Are you
But
serious? I didn't know
that's
that.
what I
Wow.
learned the other day,
Mhm,
because someone on Twitter that I follow who's a homeschooler, there's a
mhm,
woman who runs she is a co-founder of something called Bright Links here in North Carolina. It's for gifted students. She
mhm.
posted something to our state government about um about, pay, our tax dollars are taken from us or whatever. And they responded and they said, with the 529, and they had highlighted that, said, people don't necessarily know this, but 529 plans can be used for K-12
Wow.
school expenses. And she said, well, what about us homeschoolers? And they said they were going to check it out and get back to her. I haven't found out.
Mhm,
So it's one of those open questions that I have to get the answer to. But I think
mhm.
for private schooling, it can be. So, something to think about. I just caution people about private schools, because the NAIS, the National Association of Independent Schools, which is 1,600 schools strong, is more woke, more into this stuff than public schools. It is, like, way worse. And you're paying
Wow.
$50,000 a year, so don't do it.
Wow.
Or 20,000 or whatever. Some
Mhm,
Catholic
yeah,
schools have even been captured. So you have to be careful.
yeah.
Classical schools, classical charter schools, Hillsdale has a free curriculum. If you guys want to start,
Mm,
like, a micro school around classical, there's like a free curriculum. You can just go online and download it, find a teacher. So these things
wow.
are possible. But you have to be intentional about it. And I think going to the school board meeting has an appeal because all the meetings have to be open by law. That means they're
Mhm.
public. That means there's a
Mhm.
microphone and there's cameras, and people like it because they're like you said, there's footage of me
Mhm.
complaining. And that's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that parents start becoming aware of things that are happening. It's bad in that it doesn't do anything. They
Mhm.
can't fix your problem. So sometimes they cut your mic or they don't have public
Mhm.
comment periods at all because they're like, this isn't our agenda and we can't do anything about it. So we're just not even going to listen to you. And then you're also now on the government's radar as one of
Mhm.
those parents. Whereas
Mhm.
the government's not chasing down people who are supporting candidates for state legislature. They're not really like there's no sort of public forum where you're screaming into a microphone or even talking passionately into a microphone to the person running for your state general assembly or whatever. That's where you can make phone calls, write letters, stop by their office, contact their campaign headquarters, talk about what's your position on parental rights, what's your position on
Mhm.
educational freedom, what do you think about dollars following kids, get a group of enough people together and host a listening session,
Yeah, but
where you're like,
every
I've got, sorry, go ahead.
well, no, yeah, everything you said right there is why I'm, you could use the term white pilled. Look at
Mhm.
all that stuff you just that's all empowering, and it's all not as complicated as people might think.
Nope.
And it's not
Just
like
got to do
private
it.
schools the yeah, it's not like private school's the only option, so I think just spreading the word on that
Yep.
and showing that there's these options. We
Yep.
looked at the stats the other day, I think, I don't look at race first, but I thought it was interesting that African Americans, in the country
Hmm.
in general, homeschooling is skyrocketing. I mean,
Yep.
it's not like a high percentage, but from where it was before, it's
It's
been
double
going up.
digits now. 13%
Yeah.
of Black Americans are homeschooling, and that is the fastest growing group demographic of new homeschoolers. So if you're looking at, I mean, now nationwide, we've got, I think, we're up to um 11% or something. It's also double digits. It's like twice what it
Wow, it's
was a
above the
couple years ago.
average, though.
Yeah.
S
So,
Wow, so
but
Black
of
Americans are above the
that,
average.
yes,
Wow.
and of that, of the groups that are leaving, African Americans are leaving the most. Now, the interesting thing about that statistic is that a fair number are leaving because they're trying to get away from the systemic racism. Now, what I'd love to do is interview some of them to find out what their definition is, because I'll be the first one to say, ironically, that I think the education system itself is systemically racist. I think that critical theory is racist. I think that
Mhm,
the way they're teaching this racial essentialism and cultural relevance is racist. I think that things that were done in the past and how they force integrated schools when there were Black schools that were
100%.
performing beautifully and everybody was happy in their neighborhood school, and like, why are you putting me on a bus and making me
Mm,
go on the other
mm,
side of town? And now they're
mhm,
saying like, no, you have to sit next to white people. And it's like, that's racist. So this
mhm,
notion that like all excellence and quality resides in a school full of white people is racist. And
mhm,
so if that's the kind of systemic racism that you're fighting, go for it. I'm all for it. If what you're saying is we want to pull ourselves out and immerse ourselves in black separatism and racial essentialism and Kendyism
mm.
and Nicole Hannah Jones theories of all white people are, whatever,
Yeah.
then I I feel sad. I feel sad because I think they've been sold a bill of goods. I don't, and I understand it. I do
Mhm,
understand intellectually how you could come to that conclusion. There's so many very learned people are saying it, and you look at the disparate outcomes, and it seems to make sense on the surface, right? If you just looked at it superficially, you'd be like, yeah, it
yeah,
sort of makes sense, right?
mhm,
But of course, I've looked at it much more deeply, and I think the tragedy is the racism happened a long time ago, and it all the fixes just doubled down and made it worse.
mhm,
That's my take on it, and I think the answer is to get kids back into smaller neighborhood schools, like a Marva Collins kind of a setup, where maybe it is an
mhm,
all-black school because that's the neighborhood. Maybe
mhm,
that's what it is, and maybe the teacher, get teachers with skin in the game. They live in the neighborhood. Like I said, have alternate pathways to teaching and, get people out of maybe other careers and get them into teaching. Subject matter experts, encourage that. But we know what works. We've known for generations what works to teach kids to read. There's a science of reading. We know what works with math. Why aren't we doing it? That's what I just don't get.
Yeah.
Just really don't get. So, but there are
Yeah.
things you can do. I obviously my preference is for families to educate their own because I don't think anyone can do a better
Mm.
job than you. But if you can't or just really don't want to or whatever, band together with your local community and figure out how you're going to form, your own group of concerned families to support your kids in getting the education they can get out of that school come what may.
Yeah, you know, when you said that, I'm thinking about all the energy in some of these contentious school board meetings. You go look at Loudoun County. I think
Yep.
Loudoun County is ground zero for all this stuff. And I
Yep.
wonder, I hope they are putting energy into what you're saying. Imagine that
Mhm.
energy into creating basically competition for public
Right.
school. I mean, competition is what helps solve a lot of this. So you're
That's what
right.
I've been saying. I'm like, "Guys,
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
love your passion. I love your energy.
Mhm.
I'm so glad you are where I've been for the last, like, 20 years, as far as pissed off and, noticing it. This is fantastic. I'm so
Yeah.
excited. Now take that and direct it where it can actually do some good." But
Mhm.
it's a learning curve. People have to
Yep.
first, like I said, they have to first learn that the state or the school board doesn't their local school board doesn't really control these things. Their state board does. And remember, the incentives are not there for them to educate you about that. It's not their job, and their incentive isn't to go,
Mhm.
um, "We don't do this. You need to go
No,
talk to
that
those people,"
oh.
because they send them on up, and those people are like, "What did you do?" Right? So, and the union, then some of them are union loyalists, is going to be like, "No,
Mm.
no, 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 no."
No,
So
no, no, no.
it's like a little club. They're
Mhm.
perfectly fine to sit there and watch you yell and scream and whatever because they know you're not going to have any impact. They're like, "Huh,
Yep.
are you done?
And and
Next,
that's
please."
literally what they've been doing. That's literally
Exactly.
what they've been doing. Yeah.
Exactly. They will clamp down and they get ugly. And if there's any good that's come out of that is they've showed their true colors. They've shown how little they actually care
Mhm.
about the children, about the parents. And I think that has push some people into politics the other way. Like, I'm going to go support this candidate for governor, like we saw in Virginia, or I'm going to support
Mhm.
these candidates for, lieutenant governor and so on and so forth. Because very often the lieutenant governor will sit on the board of education or will do something with the board of education. So, you know, these are all good developments. I just, like I said, you got to have a plan for your kid. You will not reform public school in time for your child, whether your
Mhm.
child is in utero or
Yeah.
is in, 6th grade. You're
Yeah.
talking about a plan that's a solid couple decades that's gonna take to really do it took us the better part of probably 80 years to get here, and
Yep. It took
it's gonna take you a quite a while to unravel it and fix it. Your kid's gonna be out and done already. So if you want
Yep.
them protected and you want them to get an education, you're going to have to pick up the ball and run with it somehow.
Yep.
That's my advice.
Yep. I agree, and that's, to the larger point of our country.
Yeah.
If you don't like where our country's heading, it's gonna take generations to change,
Mhm.
change direction because it took
Right.
generations for us to get here. Yeah.
Yep. And I mean, a lot of people hear that and they're like, oh, and yeah, there's a grieving process. You have to grieve what
Mhm.
you thought was going to be when you had kids.
Mhm.
And now
Mhm.
you're coming to grips with what it actually is, which sucks. We've all been there. But when you get on the other side of the anger or the denial or wherever phase you're in and start accepting it, the good news is I really want to reassure parents that what's on the other side is a better relationship with your children.
Yep.
The more you commit to being your children's first and best teacher, whether you are homeschooling or just doing this kind of supplementation that I'm talking about, the closer you're going to be with your kids, especially if you take tech out of the mix. Don't let them triangulate. If you do nothing else, start having dinner together around the dinner table. Start having daily conversations. Do not let the schools come between you and your children because that is their goal. Don't let them do
Yeah.
it. And empower your kids. If you've got kids grade, even sometimes, 4th grade, you can tell your kid what their rights are. If
Mhm.
anything happens in school that makes you uncomfortable, your teacher's saying something that confuses you or makes you uncomfortable, you don't have to agree, right? It's okay to disagree. You are allowed to say no. It's really
Mm.
important to tell, because we are so keen to tell our kids, now listen to teacher, behave with the
Mhm.
teacher. And we forget there's a difference between good, polite behavior and agreeing with
Yep.
everything they say.
Yep.
Just going with it, what you were doing on your video earlier, where you said people just take whatever the regime says and,
Mhm.
follow it. Well, that's what the Prussian model does. Is the Prussian model's goal is to turn out good little citizens that agree with the regime. So start early. There's books by a group called the Tuttle Twins, or sort of libertarian, and talked about the
Mm.
magnificent pencil, and it talks about that. There's
Mm.
a book like, this, like Nobody Knows How to Make a Pizza, which teaches kids all about the economics of producing just like one pizza and how many
Mhm.
people are involved in this whole process. You can take a little picture book. There are ways that you can
Mhm.
educate your children that they can politely say no thank you. They can politely
Yep.
disagree with their teacher, and in fact, they have more free speech rights than the teacher. And that starts early.
Yep.
You got to really make sure that they know what their rights are at a young age. So by the time they get to high school and they get into the real deep stuff, the kid knows how to politely
Mhm.
say, "Well, I beg to differ," or "You know what? That's interesting, but I don't agree with that." And
Yep.
one person does it, and then another kid does it, and then another, and that is your idea of, now we have more of a free exchange of ideas. The kids can do it, we can't do it. We can't do
Yep.
it from the outside, but our kids can. So that's the other thing, is if your kids are in the school, make sure you teach them about personal boundaries. Don't tell them they don't have to fill out those surveys. Somebody's asking you about, "Do you feel depressed today?" Da, da, da.
Yeah, I have to look in I don't know if my kid has to do that yet. Those are troublesome, and that's a data issue too.
Yes.
A data
Yes.
to is it Facebook or other companies?
Yeah, well,
Um,
you've got, some of the people funding these, like the Chan Zuckerberg and, the Bill and Melinda Gates, that will fund these things. Some of the companies are just, they are for profit companies, and they're doing data mining. They own the data, and so does the state. That's an
that's
icky
crazy.
combination. I'm not a fan of that, right? They're
That's
data mining your
crazy.
kids about their most intimate thoughts. And they'll say, well, it's not tied to their student ID. And then you look at some of the forms and it's like, there's a student ID. Of course it's tied to their student ID. They give the
Mm.
kids a Chromebook. They give them their very own Gmail, and you don't often
Mhm.
know what the password is. They're getting our kids hooked into tech at an early age so they can follow them cradle to grave and market to them, and know they would love nothing more than, by the time your child is an adult, to be able to pinpoint with precision, like surgical accuracy, what to sell to your child in a given hour on a given day when
That's
they're an adult.
I
It's
think a lot of
creepy.
people Yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand how powerful that data is,
Yep.
and
Yep.
they need it in large amounts. So that's why they keep mining it and mining it. I mean, for artificial intelligence, machine learning to work, you need a lot of data, and they just
And
keep
they're
mining it.
surveying these kids. At this
Mhm.
point, it is almost daily. They're practically giving them a daily
Wow.
inventory of depression inventory, and
Mhm.
they say they're doing it to protect their mental health. Think about how
Yes,
suggestible kids are.
yeah.
And after a while, when you figure out there's social credit attached to being a victim or being sick, or you see it now in some teenagers will be like, "I suffer from depression and anxiety and bipolar disorder and this and that." They'll like put it in their bio. So when you've got the school doing this, anybody who's watching, and you could do this too, you can go to the CDC and in the search bar, type community school model, or just community school. And you'll come to a page, and there's actually like a little model you can click into. And you can
Hmm.
click on things in the different rooms of the community school, and it will give you the shivers. There's a health center at the school. There's little files with the health records in the school. There's, all kinds of, there's like a food place, and there's your laundry. And it's just there's a counseling center in the school.
Mm.
That's what they want. That is their goal, is to have your child's life centered at the government run school. That's literally what Hitler did.
Mm.
And you do it, these collectivist, leaders and so forth, do it because when they can get the mind of the child, and when they can get them centered on government is where I go for all things, you got it.
Mhm.
You own the future. So
Nothing. Mhm.
if if you're the one instead that the kids go to and you opt them out, whether they're doing it in your school now or not, you should go and write an opt out. Like, I opt my child out of any surveys. Do not survey my child. And you still need to ask your kid because they're still doing it. They're ignoring
I
the
heard
parents'
that.
letters. Yeah.
Yeah, I read an article a while I actually did a video on it a while back where the
Yeah.
parents opted out, they
Yep.
still did it, and the
Yep.
parents have no recourse, basically.
Yep.
This is really my if I narrow down all the issues that we have, I think that's my number one issue is, in general, digital rights.
Yeah.
I don't know how this works in the Constitution or wherever, but when those should be that should be your data. If you wanna sell it to Zuckerberg or whoever else, that I think that's
Right.
fine. But if you wanna
Right.
opt out and say, "This is mine, I'm not giving it to anybody," that needs to happen on social media. You
Right.
should be able to say, "Hey, I wanna use YouTube. I'm not giving you my data, and I'll pay even more." You
Right.
would have to pay a charge. Or Facebook, "It's not free, I'll pay." It could be a lot. I mean, you could have
Yeah.
to pay $5, $10 a month, but I own the data, you don't get any of it.
Right.
It's a big
It
problem.
it it seems, I mean, it seems so obvious, but again, that's another
Mhm,
thing to think about when you're talking to politicians or whatever, and when you think about your kids, they are invading their minds and their like, all of it. They're just breaking down those boundaries, and so the more you can assert that you're the safe person, you're the go-to person, you're the person they go to when they have questions, they have concerns, they're confused about anything, they go to you. And so that when the teacher brings up the things like, what are your pronouns? What pronouns would you like?
mhm,
You need to now have
mm,
that conversation with your child in advance. They're
mhm.
talking to children who don't know how to read
Mm,
about pronouns. They don't know what a
yeah,
noun is. Why would they know what a
yeah,
pronoun is?
and this is to me, a lot of it, and I just to be clear, I'm not against anybody. If you wanna use pronouns or however, I will honor that just to respect you, but to me, it's almost like an end around of neutrality.
Yeah.
I go by these pronouns, so I have to tell the class these pronouns. The class has to tell me their pronouns, and now we're down a path where it's like, "Wait a second, how did we get here?" That's the
And what
door.
are
I mean, that's one
pronouns?
of the door. Yeah, and then now, are you an ally or not? That puts
Exactly.
pressure. It's like, I don't
It
a
does.
kid, yeah, I like everybody, I'm not trying to be an enemy. Oh, yeah, so I'm an ally, and now you're already into, to me, dipping your toe or maybe your whole leg into critical theory of gender.
Exactly, and kids are naturally wanna, belong, they naturally wanna
Mhm,
have friends and be kind or just not be left out of the group, not be weird, and that's when people tell me like, "Well, aren't you worried about socialization with homeschooling?" I'm like, "Yes, I'm very worried about it," which is
mhm,
why I'm homeschooling in the sense that, you think your kids are gonna feel less weird being in the school,
mhm.
but imagine you're a kid who's uncomfortable with all this stuff. How weird are you feeling? You
Yep.
have to go along with it. So sometimes in order to fit in socially, you actually do feel weird. So I
Yeah.
think, I mean, all of these things can be dealt with. You just have to be aware. So like my channel exists to make parents aware of this sort of new world order of school, like what it
Mhm,
is and
mhm,
what it isn't anymore, and the things they didn't know they had to be concerned about, now they do.
mhm.
And these are really difficult conversations. I feel especially bad for the parents who are just figuring it out and their kids are already, let's say, in middle school. That is a
It's tough.
I mean, that is tough because you might have just been like happily going along and suddenly the pandemic and you're like, "Whoa." And you've got a kid who's quite naturally resistant to listening to you because that's what it means to be in middle school. And you've got to jump in and get between them and some pretty bad ideas and not alienate them at the same time. Very
Yep,
challenging. It's
yep.
very you have my sympathy.
Yeah, it opened my eyes when I read the, Not My Idea. That's a pretty famous book now, but even I believe it's for 8-year-olds or higher. It's for young kids, and it literally in the book has the girl challenging her parents and
Yeah,
her guardians in the book.
yeah.
So, yeah, it's a very big thing to have that separation. It's like, "Oh, you can't really trust your parents," or if your parents are neutral at home, you can't
Mhm.
trust them,
Yep.
type of vibe.
I did a piece for, Wrong Speak, Adam Coleman's publication.
Mm.
I think it was like a couple weeks ago, like January 31st or so, about that book. I wrote
Mhm.
an article about, it was called Innocence is Overrated, and then, that, 'cause that's in the book. Um,
Mhm.
about that book and about the problems I have, the questions I have with that book, talking about age appropriateness, whatever. So, because I had the same reaction and I saw the girl, challenging her mom, like, this is what's happening here. And the video I put in the article, I clipped a video that was a librarian reading it aloud for 6-year-olds, for kindergartners. So imagine being a 6-year-old in kindergarten class and that you're sitting in front of a screen because they are playing a video in the class,
Mhm.
and the sing-songy voice of like, "Hello, friends. Now we're gonna read about this." And I'm just thinking, these poor kids don't understand half these words, and it's scary,
Mhm.
like, this is a deal with the devil. You're talking about kids
Yep.
who probably believe in Santa, and you're
Yep,
saying
and
whiteness is a deal with the devil. Like, this
yep.
feels abusive to me. It just doesn't
Yeah.
it doesn't seem right.
I did that. I know we're off a little bit on the tangent, but I did the video on that book, and I
Yeah.
actually clipped a video from someone who was doing it online. It was on
Uh-huh.
YouTube, and the teacher didn't know what the funny tale was. For anyone listening, this is a children's book, and it gets to the point where it talks about whiteness as being the devil. Now, it's not just
Yeah.
every white person. There's nuance to it, but the teacher didn't know. She said, "I don't know why his tail is pointed like that," and she just skipped it. If you look at this book online, a lot of people don't even put that part of the book in
Yeah.
their YouTube reading of it.
Yeah. And it does say, it's a deal with the devil.
Yep.
And it, but those kind of nuances, when you're talking about concrete thinkers, like I said, they don't see the nuance. They're either
Mm.
or
Oh,
thinkers.
no.
Yeah. So it's a
Mhm.
big deal. So, back to like if we get back to the original of what we were talking about, can the teachers be neutral? Well, if a book is put in your hand by the librarian, says, "This is the book that we're reading now to the kindergartners here," or "This is the kindergarten program for reading, is this," and there you are, the teacher, and it's like, you're automatically not
Mm.
neutral. If that's the book they're choosing for
It's
library
impossible.
time, what are you gonna
Mm.
do? I mean, it's no way. As you said at the very outset, it's not just political, it's like up here. So I don't think it's possible, and I think parents are the answer to how we're going to combat that. And I don't think we have a free market of ideas, unfortunately. So we have
Nope,
to
nope,
expose our kids ourselves. You're not going to get it in the school.
nope, nope.
Just
We're having
yeah,
a great awakening, I think. More and more
I hope
people are
so.
yeah.
But I really
'Cause
hope so. I really, really hope so.
yeah.
So anyway, what else do you want to let people know about your work? So before we sign off, I just want to make sure that
Mm,
people understand what you do on your channel, because you came in here to talk to me about all of this
mm,
politics stuff, whatever, but
mm.
I want to make sure everybody subscribes to your channel and let them know what it is that you do that's different from what I do.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I talk about political issues more, and so my channel has become very political. It actually started out talking about race because of George Floyd,
Mhm.
and Ice Cube had this contract for Black America. And here's my deal is I would love it if the populist left and right. I know this sounds crazy, but populist left meaning whether you believe she is or not, like AOC and
Yep.
Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ilhan Omar and Matt Gaetz coming
Yep.
together, starting with where they agree, and then going from there. So you're going to hear me complain about stuff a lot and calling people out a lot, but at the end of the day, that's what I want to have happen. Recently, they actually got together. The letter was lame, but they did. AOC and Matt Gaetz and others wrote a letter to Joe Biden saying, "Hey, you need to get congressional support if you're going to have a major conflict overseas,"
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
that makes my heart warm. So if that makes your heart warm, come join me at my channel. Somebody in the comments was asking about the book. The book is called "Not My Idea." I forgot the
Yeah.
author, but just
Yeah, I
search that.
put that in there. It's I
Oh, okay.
think her name is Higginbotham or whatever,
Yeah.
and then I put the link to my article also, so that if you want to go read my little, 2 cents about it. Lots of people have written about it or commented on it, whatever. That was just my take as a, teacher, mom, whatever you want to call it. But it's a doozy. and it is used currently in the library and elementary school curricula of 35 different school districts in the nation. So, that just tells you how widespread it is. Just something to think about. Well, I'm going to get going. I cannot thank you enough for coming on here and spending this time with me on a Friday afternoon, and anytime, come on back and we'll dissect some more politics. I would love to know over time, you know, what you think of some of these issues, or if you've seen anything, and get your observations now that I've kind of like thrown some ideas your way.
Mhm.
If run them up the flagpole with other people, and see if you get any feedback. I'd love to hear your take on it after the fact, like what people think about these ideas. That would be really cool to find out, or your viewership, for example, of what their take on the politics of education is, because it's political now.
Yeah,
There's no getting
yeah.
around it. There's no getting around
Yep,
it.
I'll do that and get back to you. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
You're so welcome, and thanks everybody for coming. Have a great weekend.